Hi. So I'm Cameron. I eat a lot of bastardized American sushi, and I work for EasyBib.com as a front-end developer. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about using domain-driven design in the browser. Domain-driven design is a practice that's been used in server-side technologies and for desktop applications since the 90s, and in some form or another, like long before that. But the state of the web right now is that applications are becoming more and more complex on the browser, and so I'm advocating that it's time to start using this for our client-side development as well. This is the world's creepiest cat gif to say let's get started. So one of the main tenets of domain-driven design is that the job of software is to solve problems that have to do with a particular domain. So we're going to start really high level on this, and then we're going to go really low level down to the technology, and we'll actually build an application using local storage and Angular to get the HTML5 bit in there. So the question is, if that's the job of software, what is a domain? So a domain is an area of expertise. So it could be an industry field like accounting, or it could be just something that you're interested in like penguins, or just a part of life like social networking. So some examples of domains that applications are built to solve: OkCupid is built to solve the problem of matchmaking. Facebook is built to solve the problem of social networking and all of the things in that domain. SumAll is there to solve the domain of data analysis. Photoshop is there to solve the domain of graphic design. And EasyBib is built to solve the domain of academic research. So basically what domain-driven design says is that a successful piece of software starts by focusing on the domain. But that's a pretty vague thing to say. How do I focus on the domain? Well, one of the first things that you need to do is you need to seek understanding from people who understand the domain better than you do. If you're building an application for bankers, then you probably better talk to a banker and get some understanding of banking. Because you know software probably, or something like that, and you probably don't know banking that well. So domain experts are sometimes also called business stakeholders or product owners. So how do you identify an expert in your domain? Well, some examples. These people, Shad Chanim, I think. If I were to build the next OkCupid and I needed a good matchmaking algorithm, I'd probably ask these like Orthodox Jewish matchmakers how to do that. If I wanted to build a social networking application, I'd probably get some info from somebody who's a really good social networker, like Neil Taparia, who, yeah, he is, just take my word for it. If I was building a data analysis app, I'd probably ask a statistician for some information about how to do data analysis. If I was going to build the next Photoshop, I'd probably talk to a graphic designer about the domain of graphic design. And if I were going to build an application to do research, then I would probably ask my friend Ali Cloyd, who's a research librarian and knows a lot about research. Just take my word for it. So after you've talked to a domain expert about the domain, then you need to create a model of that domain that you can then use to craft your software. So what's a model? A model is a blueprint of the domain that exists in your brain. So this image is to represent that domain experts think in terms of jargon. They're on the left, and apparently developers think in terms of binary. And when they have conversations, then they can merge those two things into a model that you can use to build software. So here are some common misconceptions about what a model is. The model is not source code. You have code that reflects the model, and your code contains words from the model, but it's just an implementation of that model. The actual model exists in your brain. The model is not the database. Sometimes this is a misconception that comes up from the term MVC. Sometimes model view controller becomes data view controller, but the model is a lot more than data. It's business logic, and it's something that exists in your mind. And the model is not a diagram. The model is something that exists in your mind. The diagram is just a picture of it. So here are some of the perks of using a model. If you're anything like me, you sit in a lot of meetings with tech heads, and you have no idea what they're talking about most of the time because they're talking about implementation details. But a model gives us a shared vocabulary that we can use to talk about technical problems with non-technical people and technical people all the same. It also helps us to scalably handle complexity. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of starting out brand new on a project and thinking, oh, I'm going to build it right this time. And then 3 months or 6 months down the line, you have this completely unmanageable mess and you think, how did I get here? That's probably because you had a complicated domain. And so if you understand how to separate the domain concerns from your application concerns, it can really help you to attack that head on. Here's another good example of an application gone wrong. Another great benefit of using a model is its manageable knowledge sharing. Your front-end person is probably not going to ever understand everything that your database person knows and vice versa, but we can all understand the model and the domain. That's knowledge sharing. So the question is, how do I transport this information out of my domain expert's brain and turn it into a model that I can use to build software? So there are 3 tools that we're going to use, and John Paul and I are going to demonstrate this in a little bit. But the main ones are you just have to talk, and then you're going to diagram some things using UML, and then you better work through some use cases as well. So before we do that, I'll just talk about some of the main building blocks of domain-driven design. One of the biggest ones is entities. Entities are the nouns of your application, the stuff, the objects. So basically an entity is something that is persistent and unique. So persistent, you shut down the application, you leave the website, and you come back later and the information is still there. It gets stored somewhere. And it's also unique. You can't ever have 2 of the same entity in a single application. So you need some kind of way of ensuring that it stays unique. And that is usually a key or a combination of properties of some kind. So some examples of entities: a user is usually identified by their email, so that you never have 2 of the same user in a system. Bank accounts are identified by account numbers. You can imagine the problems that would come about if you had 2 of the same bank account. A shipping route might be identified by some arbitrary ID, like a number, and then a book or a product should be identified by an ISBN or a SKU. Value objects are objects that aren't unique, but they are persistent. And so an entity, its properties are usually value objects. A good example would be right here. The user is an entity and it has to be unique, but the name is not. So it could be shared between different users. A factory simply abstracts construction logic away from the entity. So if you have to do something complicated to construct something, make a separate object for it. A good example would be a printer. The job of a printer is not to put screws into the printer and to load itself up with cartridges and put all these components together. It's just to put ink on paper. So service is a verb of an application. If you have a job to do and you're not really sure which object should be doing it, then it's probably a good job for a service. A service can touch lots of different parts of an application. An example on our website would be a citation service, which you give it the name of a book and it returns a formatted citation for you. So it might go to an API to get information about that book and then pass that information into a book factory and then send that to a repository to save analytic information and finally format it into a view. So that service could kind of like put all of those different pieces together. And finally, a repository is a black box for data. So basically, you take an entity and you put it into the repository and you save it, and you don't know where it goes, but it gets persisted somehow. And you take it back out of the, you can take it back out later, you can change it and put it back in and save it, and it gets persisted somehow. The idea behind a repository is that you have a single interface for any given number of data persistence methods, so that you don't have to worry about protocols and all these different low-level implementation things. So that's why it's called a persistence abstraction layer, more commonly a database abstraction layer. So the last big piece here is layered architecture. In an application, it's really helpful if we have our concerns separated. So what I like to do is divide it up into separate layers. All of my domain code goes into one directory. All of my business logic goes into one directory. If there's anything that's application specific that has to do with an environment or can only run in a console or has to do with migrating a database, it goes into my application layer. And then I have a utilities layer that contains code that can be used across different domains. And that's more or less an example of all of those things. So here are some rules for layered architecture. Information flows one way, up. So your application layer can contain references to objects in your domain layer, but not the other way around. Application layer can contain references to objects in your utilities, but not the other way around. And that makes it so you don't get tight coupling, and it also makes sure that you don't have any circular dependencies. All right, cool. So let's get some practice with some help from our very own John Paul. Can I get a hand? This is a real life conversation that I had with Allie Cloyd, that research librarian, because I wanted to know how to build an application that uses the Cornell note-taking system. I don't know anything about the Cornell note-taking system, and so she was my domain expert, and this is how that conversation went, and we'll kind of like build a model using this. And I'll try to demonstrate here without a whiteboard what this process should look like as well. So, take it away.
I'd like to be rated on the acting after this.
Librarian John Paul.
I just now found out this is a real conversation. So Cameron, I'd like you to build an application for me that makes it easy for students to use the Cornell note-taking system.
What's the application supposed to do? I guess you'll have to explain the Cornell note-taking system first.
An application for the Cornell note-taking system will help students with a very specific style of taking notes that I know a lot about because I'm a domain expert. It covers big points of either a lecture or a book that they're reading. Whatever subject the student is pulling information from, they need to be able to enter very specific big points. From that, they need to be able to enter hints, like very small sentence summaries, very brief points, or one-word hints. There needs to be a way for them to see their hints, which should be next to their big points without seeing the big points, so that by looking at their hints, they're forced to come up with what the hints mean. Under the hints and big points, there should be a space where they can write a summary of all of the information they've just gathered, or whatever, or the goals for what they want to get out of this lecture, or the book, or whatever, really. Then they use the whole thing to review for a test, or a quiz, or a paper. There's a specific setup involving two columns, a skinny column on the left where their hints go, then a larger column on the right for their big points. They write their big points first in the large column. They then write their hints in the skinny column. Across the bottom is a section where they write their summary, and at some point they cover up the large column and or the summary with only the hints remaining visible, and there has to be infinite scroll.
Okay, so the layout of the page looks like this is what I'm thinking.
Yes, exactly that.
So that was a ton of information. Let's start over. It looks like we have some objects that we're dealing with in the Cornell note-taking system. So in the diagram that I'm about to draw, a box is just an object that we're dealing with. So we have a big point. We also have a column. And we have a summary. Oh, I did something weird there. Summary. So can there be more than one hint for a big point?
Actually, for each big point or meaningful item, there should only be one hint. When you cover up the big points, you should be able to look at the hint and figure out what it means in its broader context. So, if you're listening to a lecture on dogs, and one of the points is that there are hundreds of breeds of dogs in the world, if you were to write that down, hundreds, 100s, because the idea is to condense it as much as possible, hundreds of breeds, that's your big point. And your hint is many. You're setting up this system of hints with memorization. So when you write the summary, you can bring it all together. You're not just spitting out facts. You're able to synthesize all of your hints and big points into one big picture.
Okay, so we want to provide people, do we want to provide people with the ability to make more than one hint for a single big point, or do we want to make it so that you only get one hint?
The hint could also be a question or a sentence. I would say it has to be one item, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one word. A sentence would suffice for an item if you needed. If you were thinking that you would need multiple hints when it really should be one sentence or one question, or it should be broken into multiple points.
So a piece of text. So I'm wondering if a hint is really an entity in its own right, or if it really is just text that belongs to the big point. This means that the hints belong to the big points. This relationship here. Each big point also has text that's going to be displayed. So that's full text. And the summary is just a string or a piece of text. So do we want to give students the ability to highlight a piece of text and tie it to a big point? Oh, wait, sorry. Each big point also has text that's going to be displayed like the full text of the idea.
And that would be a bullet point.
Okay, great. So a column contains big points, or it could also contain hints depending on where it is. So that means it has more than one big point. A column might either display the hint or the full text, and the summary is just a string or just text. So do we want to give students the ability to highlight a piece of text and tie it to a big point?
The summary should be only their original thoughts and words. That's the point of a summary, to see if you were listening. And can you put it into your own words? So the summary shouldn't have any copied text in it. It should all be original.
Okay, so the summary is going to be free text. This is going to be a lot simpler than I thought. Does this look about right? A summary contains texts. Oh, here we go. Text, string. A summary contains text. A column contains big points, and it might either display a hint or the big point depending on where it's positioned.
When you do it by hand on a piece of paper, you have two columns, hints, and big points are their own separate thing. The idea is that you cover up one column and you see the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so hints and big points have their own separate columns. I'm also thinking that there are two other big objects here. We have project.
Give out that screenshot of a CLN or Cornell, whatever.
Oh.
Picture would be worth 1,000 words in this case.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could put that up on the meetup afterwards. Yeah, so we have a project. Would you call that a project, the full thing that you're working on?
It's probably more accurately lesson or subject. It might be subject, because you could, in theory, do Cornell notes if you were reading a chapter of a book.
Okay, so this whole thing could be one subject. What if they went to multiple classes on the same subject?
It would be different. Like if I did Cornell notes for math, English, and science, I would have 3 sets of notes for each one.
Okay, so I think subject is probably the best description for this. I'll change that to subject. A subject contains one summary and lots of big points, and it contains 2 columns. Those columns have a loose relationship with big points. So columns don't actually own the points. The subject does. But we have 2 columns, and they display either the hint or the full text. And then we have one other thing, which is our user, which has one subject, which has more than one subject. And so this is going to need to have a name. And I'm not actually going to draw all this out right now because we're running a little bit behind on time. But the idea is we have a subject, and we also have a user that has multiple subjects. So do we need to know anything else, like the school that the user is coming from? Like what the school is or anything?
Yes. Yes. We answer that question.
Yeah, so it's individual use, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing now. Perfect. So I'm glad this ended up being such a simple model. Thank you very much to John. Okay, cool. So now let's just get down. I actually built out this application, and so let's just get down to brass tacks and just blow through really quick what the architecture of it is. So the first thing that I did when I built this application is it turns out that in this, after I refined it, there are really only 2 entities that we're dealing with. So I wrote those entities. The first is big point, and the other one is subject. And each of these are implementing something that it's called entity context, which is a library that actually gives you a base class for repositories. So if you implement this scheme object on your entities, then it'll actually build those for you. It'll pull them out of local storage, and it'll give you actual JavaScript objects that have all these properties. And I'm pulling in all of the tools that I'll be using right here. So I'm using Graph.js, which basically builds an object graph from a plain old JavaScript object, and then entity context plus require.js in Angular, which just makes it a lot easier to do this stuff. So after I've defined my entities, then here we go. After I've defined my entities, then I'm going to add a couple of other things. A factory for giving me blank entities, basically a blank big point and a blank subject. And I'm also going to add a repository. So I'm just going to take this base class called repo, and I'm going to breed it or extend it so that it has these different parameters so that it can pull these things out of local storage. And then I'm going to add in some application logic. First, I'm going to put in view models. We don't want our UI to have direct access to our business objects, so I'm going to make a big point and a subject view model. And then for the pages that we're going to be having, there's going to be a lot of extra data that they're going to need and a lot of extra methods. And so these are going to be the view models for those. Cool. And then after that, I'm just going to add in the views for the two different pages we're going to have. We're going to have one page that's a list of subjects that you can select, and then another page that's a detail for each subject that's going to show you all the big points for that subject. And once that is finished, I'm going to tie it all together into one great big main.js file where I'm going to specify all my paths, and then just do a little bit of routing and add some controllers. I'm going to get the hang of this. I'm going to get to go in the right direction here pretty soon. Yep, that was it. And then finally, I'm just going to bootstrap it all using one index.html file and add a little bit of styling. There are going to be a couple of utilities that I'm going to need to pull in. One of these is an Angular directive, and the other one is going to be a remove directive. So this goes into my utilities folder. You kind of see that we have this set up so that it has the 3 different layers that we talked about earlier. And step 9, I'm just going to add in a server application that simply spins up a server and then serves up files either from the client directory, the client application, or from the root. So we can talk about this more if you want to after, but basically this makes it really easy for your application to become isomorphic if you want it to. But we're not going to deal with that right now, because this is a really simple application. And then last step, I'm just going to do npm install.
That was scary.
Bower install to get all my dependencies that I'm going to need. And then I'm going to just spin up my app server index.js guy. And let's see what our application looks like. Oh, you caught me. I had already built it. But this is actually what we just built. So we can add a new subject if we want to, such as programming. And then I can go into my programming application and I can add a hint and a full text for hint. And this is stored in local storage, so it'll be stored right there even if I reload the page. This is my summary. Yeah, and you might have noticed we didn't interface directly with local storage this whole time, which makes it really easy to port this over to a REST application or using WebSockets if we want to switch over our persistence, because it's going to implement that same interface. And that is more or less how that works. So if you just want some information about the stuff that's in this presentation, GraphJS is at that URL and Entity Context is that URL. They're both really young and highly unstable, but I'm looking for contributors. We're also looking to hire UI and UX engineers. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. But that's it. Thank you. Do you guys have questions?
The entire interaction was just you going back and forth with the domain expert with no external, no external information from other experts. So I was wondering, if there would be room for that sort of thing, like, oh, this is what a picture of this, the thing that I'm talking about might look like, or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just the kind of thing that usually happens in a shop. I mean, like, most of the time you'd rather have your developers spending their time talking to someone rather than doing research. If any other resources that are helpful for you, that's great.
Domain-driven design?
I do. It's something that I'm kind of trying to feel out because I don't feel like a lot of people are really doing it hardcore in the browser right now. So it's just taking a lot of experimenting, but yeah.
And the value you derive from it, is it in the implementation, the discipline of structuring your things in repositories and factories and entities, or is it in the ubiquitous language and how you interact with your customers, or if you can't tell, I'm a B2B, whatever it is, skeptic. I don't understand the motivation or the value, and so I'm curious to know where you see the value coming.
Yeah, I'd say it's both of those things I find benefit from. The biggest thing for me is just scale. I mean, I've worked on applications that have used this kind of discipline in the server before. And when these applications become much larger and more complex, it's way easier to scale them if you have this level of separation of concerns, which is really what DDD comes down to, is just separation of concerns. It's just an extra level of discipline on top of that.
So my take on that is that the domain modeling is the most important part, and that the coding patterns, especially in JavaScript, but more generally in the modern era where we've had this backlash from the Java-style mounds of layered abstraction, can get, I mean, differentiating between entities and value objects is valuable, and having like a storage layer, or a repository in the DDD sense is different from a repository as like an abstraction of your storage layer, which is a very Java-y, like what if I want to swap out my database thing? It's more like there's a conceptual idea of things go here, and it's a common pattern that shows up in domains. So it's very easy to like get drawn into the, especially because layered architecture is in the book, but it's you don't want to get drawn into the Java world in JavaScript just because you're modeling your domain at the same time. It's my take.
So to give you the background for what Dom just mentioned, DDD is a domain-driven design is a book. It is a gigantic book. It's a sort of boring book.
I like it.
But it is interesting. There's a lot more to learn out there.
Yeah.
It's especially like the part that Eric, the author, finds most important, and that he regrets putting as the second half of the book because people quit early, is the part about like the larger scale issues, like bounded contexts. You know, your terminology and the way of thinking about the problem changes between sections of your application. You know, maybe that's a business thing, maybe it's an implementation thing, but this needs to be isolated from this other part of the business that thinks about, like at BarnesandNoble.com where I used to work, we had the main Nook store thought of books and organized them in a completely different way. They had like folders and things like that in your library. Whereas we were working the education side, so we had like courses and terms and kind of like a book actually meant a different thing because we didn't include periodicals. We did include textbooks. So like the idea that you can just separate off things and structure your domain, and at that larger scale was a lot of the stuff that comes in the latter parts of DDD that I think is pretty valuable, because you can really get confused if you're like, well, shouldn't we just have one book entity for all of Barnes & Noble? And I'm like, no, that's a horrible idea. It will not work.
Yeah. Yeah, so further reading.
There's also a DDD meetup, by the way. It's actually very, very
It's actually very good.
Yeah, very good.
Anything else? Yeah.
So you glossed over the part where you said that you obscure one column and it has to be visible under certain conditions.
Yeah, so I whipped this out today, like in the last 3 hours. So I just didn't get around to hiding that column, but you would just use an Angular directive to do that.
Well, I'm more concerned about as part of your design. Why is it not mentioned, or there's a reason that you didn't mention it in part of your design that you're capturing?
As part of the domain design, you mean? As part of the
Yes.
model? Because it's a UI detail. If you can deal with it just by adding an Angular directive, just click on this and it goes away. I would say it's not really part of your domain, it's part of your application. Does that kind of make sense?
To a certain extent, but there seem to be business rules for when it's obscured and when it's not, and who it applies to. In fact, you don't mention any actors at all in your design. I guess that's just an implementation detail as well.
Well, there's a lot of things that I don't talk about in here because it's pretty slapdash, this particular application. But yeah, I would just say it's not persistent, and it's also not something that's necessarily going to apply to multiple applications, and so it would just stay out of that domain layer. If this were more like of an application layer kind of presentation, I definitely would dwell on that more.
But isn't there a rule that you couldn't obscure both columns? Like, that would make no sense, right?
Yeah, that wouldn't make any sense.
So would that belong in the domain? That the idea that you could have 0 or 1, but no more than one obscured entities?
It seems to me that the rule is really that you can obscure the full text column, but there really wouldn't be a reason to obscure the hint column. That might be a lack of my understanding of the domain.
I think we should take this off.
Yeah, maybe.
Follow up with the bar afterwards. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thanks.